You are now listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. This is Paul McGUIRE. On today's program, we're going to once again continue to take a deeper dive into the realm of analysis regarding aliens, extraterrestrials, ETs, UFOs, UAPs, this whole thing. And what prompts it, of course, is the resurgence of red-hot interest by the media, by government, by various activist groups into the whole phenomenon of ETs and aliens and the whole deal. So this is something that I have not chosen to land squarely in the middle of, but it's a field that I have been keeping tabs on, if you will, for a long, long time. And that goes back to, and many of you will know who I'm talking about, many of you will have no idea who this guy is, but in his time, and I think he's alive, I'm not sure. Last I heard, he had relocated his organization somewhere in Texas, but that's as far as it goes. So anyway, this guy's name was Whitley Strieber. And Whitley Strieber, as we've talked about on earlier programs, was a prolific writer of novels, of screenplays, and he wrote a book. Well, let's see, before he wrote that book, and we're going to get into that in a second. Whitley Strieber wrote a bunch of science fiction type novels that were turned into feature films. One of them was a feature film called Wolfen. It was kind of a merger of horror and science fiction. And Wolfen starred, of all people, David Bowie, the late rock and roll singer, who ironically enough, early in David Bowie's career, and from David Bowie's own mouth, I can't imagine somebody really coming out and identifying themselves as a Satanist. But David Bowie died in the last number of years. I talk about it in my book, Power from On High. I give the description. And before David Bowie's death, he promoted his music, he promoted his brand, his image with I think it was Ziggy Stardust, Invaders and the Invaders from Mars. So he was really into this space travel, astronaut, sci-fi type genre as a rock and roll singer. And his big thing was Ziggy Stardust. I remember at the University of Missouri, when I was there, a lot of people were into him. I was never really into him all that much, but they would have back then people had vinyl albums and vinyl album covers. And they had his music, Ziggy, I think it was Ziggy Stardust and the Invaders from Mars or something like that. So forgive me if you are a David Bowie fan and I destroyed his, whatever you call it, his branding. Anyway, David Bowie sang with Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. He was a rock superstar. Now, David Bowie also, like I said, got into this whole space travel, rocket travel type thing. Where did that come from, by the way? I always ask myself that question. When I remember encountering his music, which I didn't think was all that great, but people loved it, I didn't know the answer. Today, in terms of speculation, I could give you a very educated guess where many of these bygone rock and roll stars got their ideas from. Now travel with me on this. In my books, long before it became popular to discuss it, long before it appeared in Stranger Things, I was writing about in my books, the Nazi rocket scientists, the Vril Society, the Thule Society, the Vril Ya Maidens, the secret space programs of both Nazi Germany and Werner von Braun, the V-2 rockets. I was writing about and speaking about all these interlinking systems of thought and ideologies. And Werner von Braun, of course, left the Nazi space program, and he came over to America, and Werner von Braun, the German Nazi rocket scientist, became the head of the U.S. space program, commonly known as NASA. Now, that was in the 40s, and some people say Werner von Braun got here in the late 30s. I don't know about that, so let's just stick with the 40s. So Germany was this esoteric hotbed of Nazi occultism, Nazi secret societies like the Vril Society, the Thule Society, etc., etc. It was out of the Nazi rocket program that the American space program emerged. And then here in the United States, of all things, we have the influence of the world's self-identified, self-proclaimed, he called himself the world's greatest Satanist, and I'm speaking of Aleister Crowley, of course, known as the Great Satanist. And maybe you're not into that. I was never into it, never would want to be into it. But the teachings, the satanic teachings of Aleister Crowley are embedded in so many of the biggest hip-hop, rap, rock and roll artists of our time. And actually, if you go back to the late 60s and the mid 60s and the 70s, if you go back to that time period, it was exploding. If you go back to 1948, it was exploding. In fact, at what was eventually called JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, you had the influence of Aleister Crowley through an American Satanist whose name was Jack Parsons, who experimented with rocket engines and rocket fuel. And it was the research of Jack Parsons that caused JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, to be born. And who, of all people, was front and center in this and involved in it in one way or another was L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard, the prolific science fiction writer, founder of Scientology. He was a close friend at that time, way back then, of Jack Parsons. Now, Jack Parsons allegedly blew himself up in his... I'm laughing, not because he got blown up. It's just it's a mixture of a tragedy. I mean, it's a tragedy no matter who dies. It's a mixture of a tragedy and a historical reality. He blew himself up experimenting on rocket fuel. Now the question is, of course, and that's an entirely different program, did Jack Parsons accidentally blow himself up? It's kind of hard to believe that he did. It's more likely somebody helped him blow himself up. So anyway, the rocket program was going off here in the United States of America. Now, I'm laying the groundwork of that because I talk about this way back, decades ago. Long before there was a Stranger Things, long before Captain America and the Marvel Comics franchise was selling it to our kids. And I'm going to reach here in the studio and get a couple of my books where I talk about all this stuff, okay? And you need to get a copy of these books, by the way, because the printed books are going to be something that you want to hold on to in the next number of years. So I wrote a book called A Prophecy of the Future of America, which talked about all of this stuff in greater detail than I just mentioned to you in passing. And I broke ground, quite frankly, in my research. My research was heard by millions of people via a whole series of high-profile magazine articles I wrote that blew up all over the internet. And of course, back then I wasn't censored. See, now I'm a target of censorship and algorithms and bots. Back then it was the wild, wild west, if you will. And there was no invisible bot barriers blocking my information. And so it was all over the place. and I allowed it to be duplicated and reprinted on many heavy-hitting websites. Okay, so in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, I talk about a lot of these things: the Nazi rocket program, the Vril Society, the Vril Yah Maidens. I expose the entire satanic and Luciferian elite. And there were a lot of people reading my stuff way back then. And this book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, was printed according to the copyright date in 2013. And I was talking about it long before that. So a lot of people were listening very carefully when I made many appearances on the Hagman Report, Doug Hagman's show, and a number of other big shows. I was on way back with Art Bell. I was a 2-hour featured guest on the Art Bell show. And then Art Bell's show was taken over by a very prolific host, and I've been on his show about 3 times at least. And my stuff was spread all over the internet. And there were all these listening ears, and the stuff I talked about was never talked about except for a handful of people, or maybe a couple of handfuls of people were talking about it. Way back then, Steve Quayle, of course, was talking about it. Myself and a number of others, but we were a relatively small number of people. And again, this is before the great blackout, AI blackout of censorship and electronically, digitally diverting people from your website and your articles, which happens now. So, in these books, like A Prophecy of the Future of America, I exposed the whole thing. So all these people are listening to it. And I'm not going to name their names because I don't want to get into an internet war. And, you know, they have the right to do this. And I don't mind that they copied my work. I really don't mind that they took my research as if it was their own and ran with it. I don't mind that. But what I do mind is when they plagiarize my work. They would take my work, use it as if it was their own, speak as if they did the research themselves, when in fact they were totally clueless about all this stuff back then and before. And so they were profiting and building their careers on other people's research. And that doesn't necessarily bother me, because I wrote it to spread the word. I wrote it because I had a biblical worldview agenda to introduce into the mass consciousness of Americans by the millions. I had a strategic plan to embed a biblical worldview in the internet and spread that biblical worldview. And when I say biblical worldview, I'm talking about things like the reality of a Satan or a Lucifer, the reality of fallen angels and demons, the reality of an infinite personal living God of the universe, the reality of demonic Nazi rocket scientists, and all these other things. My agenda, since the public education, since mass media, since feature films, since all the other so-called mechanisms of free communication, were censoring the reality of God. Now, that isn't happening today. We've undergone a massive cultural shift because people like myself and, you know, I don't know, 20 or so others, we were plugging away at spreading a biblical worldview to the masses. So people in Hollywood were like criticizing us, criticizing me and others, but at the same time some of them were criticizing. There were 2 camps in Hollywood. There was the camp that probably they were involved personally in Satanism and the occult, and they attacked us. And then there was the camps of people in Hollywood that were genuinely looking for the truth, and they began to incorporate what we taught, what I taught and others taught, in feature films, in episodic TV shows, and my research and other people's research mysteriously ends up in all kinds of Marvel comic book franchise feature films like Captain America and stuff like that. I mean, it was all over the place. And again, I don't mind that, but I do mind when people stole the research. All they had to do to be ethically fair would have been to give a brief mention where they got the ideas, where they got the research. Give a brief mention, a brief credit of the individual, name a website or whatever. That's all you have to do. But they didn't. They kept on with it, and many of them today are very, very big social media commentators. And I don't mind that that as they grew up, so to speak, that they use my stuff and other people's stuff that I know and that you know. But I do mind, once again, that they didn't give the proper credit, as you would when you write a book. Otherwise, it's called plagiarism. Okay, enough said on that. So, in A Prophecy of the Future of America, I got into predictive programming before people had any idea what it was really all about. And I exposed the reality of a Luciferian elite. I exposed the interfacing of that and Bible prophecy and all kinds of stuff. So, in a moment, we're going to take a deep dive together into this entire field, and we're going to discover what is now front and center in the mass culture, in the sense of we have Steven Spielberg's alien E.T. movie called Disclosure, or Disclosure Day. And then we have a docudrama that is exploding called Disclosure, and something else with the title. So we have all this discussion because of Spielberg's upcoming movie to be released this summer on Disclosure Day, and we have the docudrama on Disclosure, and all this research pouring out. And really, I must say, some of the best research that I've seen out there on these topics is coming from a select number of Christian experts, some whom you know and I know. And the only reason I'm not naming names in particular is because I don't want to appear like I'm favoring one and ignoring another. And also, I'm not plagiarizing their work. But they have done some excellent research in distinguishing between the possibility of a genetic hybrid, such as the Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Enochian angels, and the fact that they may be what the mass culture, like people like Steven Spielberg, they refer to as aliens or ETs. Now, one guy who many of you know, I hadn't really had the opportunity to review his work up until recently, in light of all this disclosure stuff. I'd heard his name, but I hadn't had an opportunity to review his work. And many of you know him. His name is Timothy, and I believe you pronounce it Alberno or Albino. And so, Timothy, if you're listening by some chance, I apologize, man, for mutilating your name. Forgive me. But your research is excellent, especially as you expose the layers between genetically modified or genetically created entities and the possibility of biological aliens from another planet versus the Nephilim, Rephaim, fallen angels. And you really, I'm just touching on your research, which I think is excellent. And the most important thing is it's well done and it is biblically sound. So, You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Be sure to visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. And we will be back in just a moment. Once again, you are now listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. I've been sequestered away doing deep dive on book writing projects, film projects, and all kinds of stuff with the intention of, hopefully by God's grace, achieving a global impact. Two other people I want to mention in regards to being credible pioneers in the research of aliens, ETs, fallen angels, Nephilim, Rephium, and that whole thing, who are Christians, who are like real Christians. And one would be Steve Quayle, he did work on this like a bazillion years ago. I mean, excellent work. And Steve was kind enough many, many years ago to platform a number of videos I just simply shot in my living room of my house, and he blew them up on the internet. So thank you, Steve, for doing that. And of course, Doug Hagman for giving a vehicle to it. And a person that I've had the privilege of speaking at a number of Bible prophecy conferences with, who was also a pioneer in this research, is L.A. Marzulli. Excellent research, cutting-edge research, and all of these men are solidly biblical. Okay, so this is now exploding because we have all these government investigations into aliens, extraterrestrials, ETs, etc., etc. Now, this area of research is not a core area of research for me personally, but it is an ancillary area of research in the sense that you can't ignore this. This is so, I've been toying around with this concept of an alien genesis for many years now, and you can't ignore it. An alien genesis is simply the thesis that an alien race visited planet Earth maybe thousands of years ago or more, and mated with human women and birthed a genetic hybrid of alien plus human women and a new non-human race. Because when you tamper internally with somebody's genetic code, in order for a person to be authentically a human being, they must have authentic human DNA, an authentic human genetic code. In the Bible it says God made us, that's you and me. He made them both, he made who? Adam and Eve. He made them both male and female. and God made them in his own image. So what does that mean? It means that God Almighty, the infinite personal living God of the universe, made mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he made them both male and female. And that means we have, this is very important, I've been talking about this for many decades, we have the DNA of God. Now, back to this Whitley Strieber thing. So he wrote, he did Wolfman and a bunch of other stuff. And then he wrote a best-selling, and he sold it as a non-fiction book, but it reads as if it was a novel. He alleged, and I'm using the word alleged deliberately, Whitley Strieber alleged that a bunch of aliens visited him at his cabin. I believe it was in the Adirondacks of New York State. So at that time, Whitley Strieber was like a hotshot screenplay writer, novel writer. He's making obviously a lot of money way back then. And then he comes up with the story that the aliens not crashed, but got him in his cabin, because a lot of affluent people that live in Manhattan back then had a dual home and cabins in the woods that are very beautiful, the Adirondack Mountains. And he claims these aliens visited him and did all kinds of alien abduction experiments upon him, and it's rather gruesome and bizarre. In fact, Whitley Strieber's entire account is depicted in a feature film version of his book Communion. So the book he wrote describing the aliens that visited him rather brutally in his cabin in the Adirondack Mountains, that book sold millions of copies. He ended up on shows like, this is way back then, the biggest TV evening talk shows, the comedy shows. He ended up on the biggest shows in that period talking about his alien abduction experience. And then this was all put together in a feature film years later, starring Christopher Walken, the actor, the famous actor. So Christopher Walken in the feature film version of Communion, he plays Whitley Strieber. Okay, so Whitley Strieber made a career, of course, of talking about his alien abduction, etc., etc. Now, I was always suspicious, because I read the book way, way back then, and I saw the movie way back then called Communion. But I was always suspicious. I was always uncomfortable with Whitley Strieber's claims, because part of me said, the cynical part of me said, did Whitley Strieber concoct this entire super fantasy saga of the aliens abducting him in his remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains? And I'm very familiar with the Adirondack Mountains, because as a young boy, I used to go to summer camp. Yep, Camp Poco Moonshine. No, it's not a joke. It's an Indian name. As a young boy, I attended Camp Poco Moonshine in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains. And as a young boy, one of the things we did at Camp Poco Moonshine was we climbed the 46 tallest, highest mountains in an interconnecting mountain range that was all over New York State, Maine, and adjacent states. And what the main thrust of this summer camp was to toughen up young boys like me and have us climb and hike up a trail of mountains, 46 of them. And when you successfully climbed all 46 mountains, you got like some kind of badge, an award, and you were entitled to call yourself a, quote, 46er, because you climbed 46 of the tallest mountains in the Adirondacks. So I remember climbing a bunch of mountains. I don't know if I achieved all 46. I think it was like one or two mountains short of the 46. But I remember, I think the name of this mountain was called Wrightwood. And it had an eerie reputation because Wrightwood Mountain was where a military Air Force jet carrying a nuke crashed in to the very top of Wrightwood Mountain. And the government, I don't know how they did it, but they got up there really quick, and any discussion of a nuclear weapon disappeared, and there was no evidence of a nuclear weapon. But I'll tell you what happened. When I climbed up Wrightwood with a bunch of the other young guys in this summer camp, we got there and you could still see, it was hardly recognizable. You could still see the remains of one of the jets that had crashed into the mountain Wrightwood. And I remember picking up a piece of metal, which was a piece of the jet. And I think either one pilot or both pilots died, I don't know. But I picked up a piece of the jet, and that to me confirmed the fact that yes, a military jet did crash into Wrightwood Mountain. And I remember picking up a metal piece of the jet, and it was all stained with blood. And that brought home to me in a very kind of psychologically brutal way that this whole legend of a jet crashing into Wrightwood Mountain was not some made-up story. So anyway, at the base of the mountains were the Adirondacks, and the mountains themselves were in the Adirondacks, one of the most beautiful mountain ranges in the world. So I was very familiar with the landscape of the Adirondacks. It's very beautiful. And that's where Whitley Strieber had his summer cabin, or whatever you want to call it. That's where he claimed the UFO landed and that the aliens abducted him and did all these strange biological experiments on him that had to do with reproduction. And in the movie, and I don't necessarily recommend the movie because it's rather graphic and it's rather gross. The aliens, it's actually kind of disgusting. The aliens are exploring the reproductive capacities of a human being. So anyway, this book sells millions and millions of copies. Now this is a long time ago. So this is my introduction into, speculation and research regarding aliens. Now, a number of years later, a book you may have heard of, an author you may have heard of, he wrote it in a very popular style, and it came out around the same time period as Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. And the name of this book was called Chariots of the Gods. And the thesis of Chariots of the Gods was that the chariots of the gods were UFOs manned by aliens, and that the secret behind all the super civilizations, the secret behind the pyramids and these monuments all over planet Earth and advanced technology, according to von Daniken. And von Daniken is the author of Chariots of the Gods. And he did a whole bunch of Chariots of Gods type books and feature films. I remember seeing a major special. I think it was on ABC television network. It was a 2-hour national special with millions of people watching it. And it was all on von Daniken and his Chariots of the Gods theories. So I got, again, reintroduced further into this whole alien seeding of planet Earth and the presentation by numerous authors that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was not fully true, and that the more accurate documentation of the history of the human race could only be found, according to these researchers and writers, through some kind of alien invasion of planet Earth. And there have been, so many books, so many documentaries, so many videos, so many spin-offs of this thesis. And it continues to have an incredible amount of resilience. People are embracing it because, look, we all know this, or at least most of us know this. When you reject the truth, that there is indeed an infinite personal living God of the universe, the Creator God, capital C, who created not only all of creation according to the Bible, but according to the Bible, the Creator God created Adam and Eve, humanity, and everything that's good in this world that you and I live in. However, whether you're an MIT scientist, a theologian, when you reject the truth of the biblical account, you're stuck with a big void. You don't have an answer to the dilemma of what allowed mankind to exist on planet Earth. And to say it happened through mere random chance over 200 million years is absolute insanity. Somebody had to have dropped you on your head when you were a little baby. I mean, I'm serious. I'm serious, and I'm being sarcastic at the same time. It's such a lame theory. It's pathetic. So there's a void in our society, and people who are honest intellectually are searching for a more viable answer than Charles Darwin's really lame theory of evolution, which is promoted heavily by the globalist and Luciferian elite. And so this is why I think people like Spielberg and so many others have grabbed hold of the alien genesis type theories. Okay, you're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Be sure to visit paulmcguire.us. Remember, we are doing what we can to reach as many people as possible in America and the world at this pivotal hour in not only America's history, but this pivotal hour in the history of the human race. We are at that juncture in space and time. We're at that juncture where the signs of the times that Jesus Christ talked about are exploding all around us. And people are demanding an authentic and credible answer. So our task, our assignment that I believe that God gave us, our mission, if you will, is to go out into all the world and not only preach the gospel, but communicate intelligently and in a spirit-filled manner and guided by the structure of the Word of God, communicate a biblical worldview so that people might come to the truth, so that people might come to Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior.